Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to be part of the session today. It's morning over here in Victoria, BC, the capital of the British Columbia province, and really pleased that you would take the time to join us today on the discussion on civic leadership, citizenship, and participatory democracy. We'll be calling on lessons from a global response to systemic racism. While we wait for others to join us this morning, I would like to just respectfully acknowledge the lands on which I'm privileged to build relationships, to do work, and to be holding this conversation today. I acknowledge we respect the lands of the Lekwungen speaking people on whose traditional territory the university, the Victoria Forum, which is hosting us today, stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wusanic peoples whose historical relationships to the land continue to this day. And I'm sure that for everyone, including the panelists this morning, we're all calling in and joining in from different parts of the world and different places. I'd like for us all to take a moment to acknowledge the lands on which we're privileged to do work and to think again on our connection to those relationships. Please note, dear all, that this session is being recorded today and the recording would be made available thereafter. As well, I will be introducing the panelists in just a little bit, but just wanting to provide a premise for the conversation that we'll be having today. And a good place for me to start is with a quote by John Dewey. "The good society was, like the good self, a diverse yet harmonious, growing yet unified whole. A fully participatory democracy in which the powers and capacities of the individual that comprised it were harmonized by their cooperative activities into a community that permitted the full and free expression of individuality." That's a quote from the great philosopher John Dewey. And I really can't think of a better place for us to start this conversation today, as we think in recent times, all of the happenings around the world and responses to inequalities that have permeated systems and long-standing issues of systemic racism, of inequities across board. Particularly among people of color, Indigenous and Black in particular, there has been a resounding clamor for change, for systems reforms, and for institutional audits and accountability, most notably in the wake of the killings and the spread of the Black Lives Matter movement in the USA. We will try as much as we can today to contextualize this conversation and bring in some of the lessons that we've learned through these uprisings around the world. A civil society seeking new ways to work collaboratively to address the most pressing needs in societies and communities around the world. So also corporate organizations are paying more attention to their role in responding to social needs. Political systems are rethinking age-long policies, and there is an increased need to shift from the status quo. Across board, there is a shift in power, in leadership, and the onus for shared leadership is more relevant now than ever. Joining me today are three amazing speakers who would be discussing social, political, and economic ramifications of the changes and lessons we've learned from the global response to systemic racism. And a good place for us to get this conversation going this morning. It is my very, very great privilege and honor to welcome Carol Ann Hilton, who would be speaking on some of the economic ramifications of our conversation today. Carol Ann is the founder and CEO of the Indigenomics Institute. She is a recognized First Nations business leader and advisor with the International MBA program from the University of Hertfordshire in England. A partnership with the Vancouver Island University. She currently serves on the BC Emerging Economy Task Force as an advisor to the Minister of Jobs, Trade and Technology. Carol was appointed as a senior advisor to the Federal Finance Minister on the Canadian Federal Economic Growth Council. She has led the establishment of a line of thought called Indigenomics, the building and strengthening of indigenous economies. Carol Ann is currently authoring Indigenomics, a global power shift. Carol Ann, really pleased to have you here today. Would you please share some opening thoughts on these lessons from around the world?
Absolutely, thank you. Klassish Caroline Hilton, Heshquiak Supsish. I come from the Heshquiak Nation, and my Nuu-chah-nulth name is Wakatush, which means big sister. I introduce myself to you in my own Nuu-chah-nulth language to both center a reality that of Indigenous empowerment today that sees an uprising of the return to our Indigenous languages, which was made illegal in the development of Canada and in the polarization and isolation of the Indigenous populations here. So some of you may have been introduced to the concept of Indigenomics, and some of you that may be a new word. What is important in being able to speak about racism, the divide that we're seeing nationally and globally, and the quickening of that pace of how we're seeing it and how that's coming into visibility. We live in a country here in Canada that is often referred to as commonly of the strong values, of which racism is not referred to here. So realizing where and how we bring visibility and voices to that experience of racism is a significant undertaking and an exercise of response to today and what we're seeing through this COVID response. So I introduced this concept of Indigenomics to you essentially to be able to introduce the concept that Indigenomics is a collective response to the systemic exclusion of Indigenous peoples in the development of this country here in Canada. Indigenomics is the response. It's to build a collective response of Indigenous economic inclusion in the future of this country. That is the uncomfortable space to begin to facilitate and to be able to build from. It is only when we acknowledge the truth of systemic Indigenous economic exclusion that we can also embrace a future based on Indigenous economic inclusion. Going back to the foundation of systemic designed exclusion, I bring to your attention the early years of a colonial structure called the Doctrine of Discovery. That in itself founded the Americas and allowed the dehumanizing of the existing Indigenous populations to establish legal construct of the right to establish title on the North American lands previously and also currently known as Turtle Island. If you understand the history, function, and process of how the Doctrine of Discovery came into existence, what is experienced is it will trace back all fee title lands and establish the colonial structure of land ownership, of polarization of the Indigenous populations, or removal from our traditional economic territories. The second aspect I want to draw your attention to is the currently existing only race-based legislation in this country of Canada, the Indian Act. So based on a concept of polarizing the Indigenous populations from their traditional land base, what it established was the perfect design for economic exclusion and to establish a forward-based country that did not include having Indigenous peoples having a seat at the economic table of this country. Next, I bring to your attention the modern tool of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. As an international instrument, you might ask, well, aren't Indigenous rights human rights? You would think that was true. However, the experience of the requirement to have specific Indigenous rights outlined describes the space of where these rights have not been experienced or realized over time, both here nationally and globally. So within the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, this includes the inherent right to an economy. It includes clauses that describe the right to continue as peoples. Now, you may never have reflected, I as an individual, as a cultural reflection of who and where I come from, have a right to continue as a person. When we see the experience of that expressed of why it's even required to be a right, that is where you see and are able to demonstrate the Indigenous experience. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples includes the right to continue to practice our ways. But in order to continue to practice our ways requires the ability to access lands, to access resources, and to undertake traditional activities on those. The instrument includes the right to self-determination. So when we look at the fundamentals of the space of Indigenous rights and the expression of those, how that is related to economy, it also draws attention to the understanding of building and designing Indigenous economic growth. I want to demonstrate a point that establishes the fundamental foundation of which this country here in Canada is built through the lens of what I call and describe from the early language was the Indian problem. As long as we see through the lens of Indian problem, that is the response that is built. So seeing Indigenous peoples as a cost on the burden, as a burden and a cost on the fiscal system, that is foundational to the narrative of Indigenous economic exclusion. It's the foundation of the narrative of racism and the perception of the Indigenous population. When we look at this concept called the Indigenous socioeconomic gap, which is ever widening and becoming more descriptive within this COVID environment, we look to the space of, again, this concept of economic isolation of the Indigenous population, the structures of that economic isolation, and the socio outcomes of how that is experienced. I posit essentially that we need to stop measuring socioeconomic gap and start measuring economic strength of Indigenous peoples, because it's there that we will find self-determination, we will find self-actualization, we will find the expression of the right to an economy, the right to continue as peoples, and a pathway forward of that continuation of practicing our ways. I come from the New Channel tradition, and I want to bring your attention to a court case where we had described we had lost as a people. So this is the west coast of Vancouver Island, in a community of 14 different communities, where we had said and challenged the state that we had lost a right to a fundamental ability to access an economy. So our people were put on tiny reserves, and the acts that surrounded that, whether it was the Fishing Act, whatever that looked like, removed our ability to connect to the land and resources and actually establish the right to an economy. So in taking Canada to court, what we fought for was the right to a commercial fishery, that our modern expression of who we are was built on the foundation of the development of Canada and prior to that of how we expressed the ways that we lived on the land. In telling this story, what is important is that the Spanish crown funded the first explorers that came in contact with our people. Because that was crown to crown based evidence, what the explorers identified was that our people brought canoe loads of fish, and that in this century, how that was expressed was the right to an economy and the right to commerce, the commercial function, and that it was a trade function, all the core elements of an economy today. So I live in a country that essentially that Indigenous peoples do not have the right to sell fish for money. The fundamental constructs of economy, of commerce, and our ability to express our existence is all embedded within the historical structures and foundations and formations of Canada itself. When we are able to build from these truths, we are able to build from a new story of Indigenous socioeconomic gap. We're able to build a new story of Indigenous economic strength, and we're able to build a new story of Canada's systemic design of the future of Indigenous economic empowerment today. This is the uncomfortable space to be able to build from. We need to address the historical structures and experiences of racism, how that's expressed in the metrics, and how we form meaning about what that means today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I really can't think of a better way to situate the conversation, but more so some of the historical challenges that we have come to name. I'm excited for us to dig deeper into the conversation today and to explore within the political landscape, within the political sphere, what are some of the systemic issues that we see coming through. And it's a real pleasure to have Sam Perman here today to share some insights. In November 2019, Samantha made history as the youngest woman ever elected to the Marlborough City Council at age 24, and the first-time candidate to top the ticket in a council race. Sam currently works at a nonprofit dedicated to evidence-based policy and is a 2020 fellow at the Philanthropy Connection. Her background is in state and federal legislative policy work, community organizing, and youth civic education, where she helped secure passage of the 2018 Massachusetts Civic Education Law. Sam is passionate about empowering the next generation of leaders, especially young women, to be involved in government and public service. She serves as chair of her city's Cultural Council, was a 2018 Institute for Canadian Citizenship Fellow, and received her degree from Emory University. Sam, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me, and I feel so grateful to share this space with so many incredible leaders, both those who are panelists, moderator, and those who are watching, as I know that the real leadership is everyone in the community. And so I feel like I sit at the intersection of so many of the topics that we could discuss in this political realm. Young women in politics, civic engagement, youth participation, and the 2020 election, which I know is probably something in the United States that is a conundrum of many things. But I wanted to start, sharing a little bit more about myself. I know I'm coming to this discussion as an American, which the last thing we need is more Americans sharing their viewpoints. But hopefully, sharing a little bit more about myself will help inform, how I see what's going on in the United States and how that's sort of a case study for many things happening at a larger level. And so when I decided to run for office, that was, something I never would have expected. It really came from my background as an organizer and working in civic education. And I really started to realize that if I wanted to make a difference in my community, that I really had to step up and become more involved. And many people ask me, when did you know that you wanted to run for office? But more importantly, were you always so civically engaged? So I shared that, the very first time I was able to vote was in the 2016 election, which many of you know resulted not in the first woman president of the United States, but in the election of Donald Trump. And so I was, 21 at the time and had been trying to navigate the very confusing process of voting as a young person. So I missed many of the early elections where I was from in Massachusetts. And so I registered to vote in the state of Georgia, which now is a conversation of the election 2020 continued in the United States, as it really will decide the runoff elections in the Senate will decide control in the United States for the Senate moving forward. And it was really challenging to vote. I had long lines, I had to show my ID, and I felt like that was just one experience that I had in the city of Atlanta. And I know that the disenfranchisement of people of color and communities across not only the state of Georgia, but the entire South in the United States is very challenging. And, you know, several months after getting elected, so I want you all to place, you know, I got elected in November 2019, and I finally was like, I'm going to go on a little break. So I ended up going to Chicago. And I just remember getting off the plane and, you know, turning my phone off of airplane mode and discovering that Donald Trump had been impeached. I got a notification on my phone. And it really, I just stopped and realized that, you know, my existence as a young woman in government really was the antithesis of Donald Trump. You know, here was this guy who was built off of hate and really probably the worst parts of our country. And here was I, someone who was trying to get involved in our community. And so, you know, imagine taking office, you know, in the backdrop of this horrendous division, exploitation, and hate that really is over the entire United States. And it's really been a tough 4 years in the country. And I'm sure everyone from a global perspective is watching it, you know, with laughs and tears, because it's been really alarming. With the passing of leaders like John Lewis and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, to the tumultuous handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, all happening at the same time as a census count, a national election, the centennial of women's suffrage in the United States, it can feel really easy to be defeated and to feel like, does the United States, you know, have any real future? And we know that it has been built on a system of codified racism and slavery that we are still dealing with this to this very day. And so it's no surprise that the recent election is not going down without a fight. And so, you know, many of you might have seen there have been false claims of voter fraud in the 2020 election. And I think it really is coming to light due to people being in their own echo chambers, you know, listening to those who share the same beliefs as them rather than connecting with those who share different viewpoints. We've seen divisions within families and communities. And like we said before, right, all against the backdrop of COVID-19. So the question I ask myself that I feel like relates to any geographic region that you may be in, but is democracy working? Are we not facing every single ism of the horrible parts of our communities compounded by a pandemic that has exacerbated every inequality that we know, and that really has been ignored by the powerful elites for some time? And many of the solutions that we've been seeing proposed have been really band-aids and a return to a false reality, when in actuality we need to drastically revolutionize our thinking and reform the institutions that were designed to support the white, wealthy, and male among us. And so some of the things I tell myself that, you know, might be helpful, you know, I'm reminded that democracy, especially in the United States, is an experiment. And every single day we have to live out the security of that experiment, making sure that we are, you know, tinkering with it and making changes, but also that it's very fragile. And without our presentation and efforts and relentless commitment to seeing a more perfect union, then, you know, the country will not ever be what we want it to be, and those values will never be lived out. And so what do we rely on for an effective government? Accurate information, transparent communication, protection of our safety. Some of the things that we are seeing at the fault lines currently in the United States. And now even public health has been weaponized as a partisan issue. And we're seeing the horrific remains of that right now, with over 10.6 million cases of COVID-19 in the United States and over 242,000 deaths. In Massachusetts alone, which, if any of you know, is a very tiny state in which I live, it has around 6 million people. We've lost 10,000 lives, and it's still continuing to go up. And so we see such a disregard for community and an emphasis on the self. This erosion of democracy that I see is about the individual and not the community. And it's really apparent through the COVID-19 pandemic how linked our futures are to one another, and that the decisions that we make influence our collective future. And so I'm really motivated, though, by the work of young people in our communities and by the movements that I see at the forefront, whether this is the Black Lives Matter movement, the women's marches, climate justice. We are seeing young people take the future into their own hands and not waiting for policymakers who refuse to hear them for those decisions to be made. And we have seen it even recently. I went to a women's rights march right after the appointment of a new Supreme Court justice, and was just really moved by all of the people who came out, even during such extenuating circumstances. And even the results of the 2020 election, with the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, the United States' first female vice president, which many people might have never thought they'd see, and the first woman of color and person of color to hold the office. And that was really a tribute to the Black women who were on the ground organizing across the United States, our leaders, community organizations, young people, and people of color across this country who turned out in record numbers. And we see that even happening with the election of people to high office, such as Cori Bush, who was from Ferguson after the tragic murder of Michael Brown, who's able now to be a congressional leader. So I say all of this to say that, it seems like we are in the darkest hours, and that is the most important time for us to step up and be having these conversations around civic engagement, democracy, citizenship, participation, because if we're not having them and having open dialogue about what the future might hold, we will be very subject to repeat the same problems over and over again and exist in those same cycles. And I really do believe that young people are the answer. And I've seen that firsthand and looking forward to discussing that further. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sam. Yourself and Carol Ann, just the insights and perspective there. You touched on so many things that I'm just super eager for us to unpack through the course of this conversation. But just before then, again, my real pleasure to welcome our third and definitely not the least panelist today, Prasad. Prasad is the founder and executive director of a thriving nonprofit called Spark Foundation. Spark Foundation offers life education programs to youth throughout Canada. Because of her work and leadership, she's the recipient of the Princess Diana Award, Canada 150 Award in Leadership, Surrey Board of Trade Top 25 Under 25, the Governor General Sovereignty Award, and she is the author of a book titled Because We Can. She continues to travel the world in pursuit of building sustainable communities. Prasad has been interviewed, published, and written about in over 50 articles in the world. Prasad is a United Nations Sustainable Development Goal advocate. She is a shameless idealist leader that is simply empowering the next generation. For this 22-year-old, this is just the beginning. Rochelle, really pleased to have you today and very, very keen to hear your thoughts on some of these divides that we've started to speak on.
For sure. Thank you so much for having me. And as well as the panelists, it's so great to hear your voices and your ideas around these amazing, empowering driven topics that need to be discussed and need to be critically think about. And I just wanted to start by saying that it's incredible that we're creating this platform right now for youth like myself and other young people to speak about our opinions and to really speak about what matters to us most. And I just wanted to start off with this one fact that I remind myself when I do a lot of youth engagement work, and that in Canada, our population is made out of 30% of people under the age of 24. And the reason I'm stating this fact today is to, number one, state that, yes, there's a lot of young people living in Canada and around the world. But number two, are we giving them the support and resources to make sure communities across Canada are stable for the future, because we are the next generation? Are we supporting and mentoring these people? What are we doing to help? So that's the perspective I'm coming from today. I'm coming from the grassroots organization sort of part of it, the citizenship, the youth organization, and to see how young people fit into this discussion as well. In saying that, every action that we implement today will impact generations to come. So in saying this is why it's so important to foster a couple of points that I have. So number one, supporting of youth voices and platforms, which is exactly what the Victoria Forum is doing, and hopefully that we will be doing towards the conversation today. And number two, acknowledging that we don't know everything and that we need help to learn about our social circumstances from each other. So I truly believe that in order to build sustainable communities, in order to abide by the 2030 UN SDGs that we need to achieve, we need to include young people at the forefront of this, and we need to include voices and perspectives that are going to help shape for an optimistic future. And if we don't do that, 2030 seems a bit harder to fetch. So yeah, in saying that, as we move forward in our discussion today, I hope that we keep in mind the 3 points that I mentioned, as well as mentoring the next generation and how important that is. Short and simple, I'll pass it back to Ruth.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. So much to touch on, and I'm excited to get into it. I'm going to pick on something that I heard earlier. I heard it in different ways from Carol Ann, from Sam, as well from Rochelle. You echoed it a bit, but it's just the concern about institutions that we have right now, and starting from that political space. Is democracy working for us? And what alternatives do we have? I see you nodding, Sam. Do you want to go for this?
I can jump in with a brief reflection. I would love to hear what my co-panelists have to say. It's hard to say that it's always working. I guess it depends on what our bar of success looks like. You know, we're definitely not at a place where people are treated equally in all facets of the law, have the same access to resources, and being able to live out that real, you know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as it's stated in the Declaration of Independence of the United States. So I think that pursuit of happiness looks so differently for different communities. And so, like I said in sort of my opening remarks, democracy is something that has to constantly evolve. And it invites all of us to participate, right? It's not a stagnant state, right? It's very active. And so every time someone is, you know, quote unquote, agitating or protesting or getting involved in the process, that is democracy, right? It's not just this like very removed experience of people in a chamber voting, right? It's the activity of pushing the envelope and fighting for the changes that we deserve. And so it's something that I think it's reshaping how democracy should be looked at by the general public.
Thank you very much, Sam. And Carol Ann, you spoke to some of the ways that within economic communities we can start to work towards erasing these historical barriers and inequalities that have existed. Just in the wake of the pandemic and how much, in particular, Indigenous groups and more broadly, people of color have been impacted, would you say there are some notable changes that you started to see? Is there leadership emerging, and what are the forms of this leadership?
Absolutely. I think that in the function of democracy, in what we're seeing is how to mend, how to heal, how to come back to being in relationship. That is what is becoming visible. And in a global context, there was this historical questioning and security of the securitization of democracy itself. There's whole histories of how with the lack of relationship and understanding of political structure has also shaped democracy and its instruments. I draw your attention to, again, go back to the historical context. If we actually understand the truth of the formation and influence of Indigenous worldview on democracy itself, we would go back to the Iroquois and ask, what does this mean? We would go back to the wampum belt and ask, what did this actually mean, and what can we learn from this today? So I think that we make the assumption that the systems are what they are, they happen to us, but really this is a time of design where we can reshape our engagement with money, with policy, with economy overall, as what becomes visible are the ones who are left behind. So I write of this concept of who is at the economic table. If it's only built from one worldview, that's really problematic. And this is a time to be able to hear different worldviews, because that's where the expansion and growth is going to happen. Here in Canada, we see a context of this idea of Indigenous nations that either do not have connectivity to Wi-Fi or do not have clean running water. We have a nation in Ontario right now who is trying to deal with surrounding regional COVID outbreaks and do not have access to clean water, where communities are evacuated. So understanding, how is it that there's millions of dollars available in recovery, but none of that has ever been for Northern Indigenous community Wi-Fi connectivity, or access to clean water. Those are basics and fundamentals, and often not a perspective of how Canada is viewed from. Thank you.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you. What a stark reality we have. You mentioned something, Carol Ann, and Rochelle, wondering if you might have a response to that around the people that are being left behind. What are some of the trends that you are seeing with the communities that you're working with and that you're serving in terms of who's most impacted?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that question. In terms of people that are being left behind, definitely youth and young people are in that category. Especially during the pandemic and even just before, I'm going to touch a little bit on resources that the government has to offer in inner communities. A lot of the times youth are left behind when it comes to interpretation of language, even when so-called adults or people that identify over the age of 25, so to speak, publish a policy or they publish a resource for a health forum. Sometimes that doesn't translate into the language of youth, and not even that. Sometimes the resources are not catered to youth, especially during the COVID pandemic. There have been a lot of media releases, a lot of resources and activities that are suited for families or for individuals, but not really suited for youth that are showcased in a way where they can take action towards reducing COVID-19 in their areas. In saying that, I also wanted to touch on something else that you mentioned, Ruth, and it was on different forms of leadership that are coming out of the pandemic, if that's okay. And I've seen that young people and adults are really bridging the gap. It's connecting people in a way that I've never seen before. Pre-COVID and pre the pandemic, I've seen where there was this diversification within adults and young people. And now there have been so many Zoom meetings and so many community connection pieces where they're talking to each other. We're actually able to reach out to people over the age of 25 and ask, what can we do together to make a difference? And one example I have is a organization that just started here. It's called the Seek COVID-19 Awareness Organization. What they do is they translate all the media releases and all the resources into other languages such as Hindi or Punjabi. And this is two worlds coming together, young people and those who are in their mature stages of life. So that's one form of leadership that I'm seeing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And I think what I've heard from you, just across board, I've heard quite a bit on the impact of the pandemic as a whole on youth and how they're being left behind and how there's got to be that shift and shock to the system. Also with Indigenous people and more broadly, people of color, including Black people, how increasingly some of these challenges are becoming more obvious. And also, if we wanted to talk about women, whether it's women of color or whatever other subcategories we want to look at within that, there is this form of intersectionality that's coming out. And to Rochelle's point about how this unique challenge that we've had within the year so far has also presented an opportunity for finding solidarity and for finding connections. Do we want to talk about some of that that's forming? Are we seeing whether it's sector groups or communities stepping out of their usual niche and stepping into that space to collaborate, to want to engage differently? Carol Ann, I see you nodding. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, for sure. I think as am I connected to the internet? I just got to notice that I'm not. I'm good.
Yes, we hear you. Yes.
What I'm seeing here in Canada as what was a response to the Black Lives Matter movement in America was that the spillover to that here, we see demonstration of leadership. Examples like West Hall setting up the Black North Initiative, being able to bring that into the heart of Bay Street itself to address systemic racism. So when we look at this concept of Black North and engagement of CEOs in instrumental positions, it's really addressing the systemic racism, the mindsets, and establishing the space to increase opportunities for Black people in corporate Canada. what is significant in an initiative like this is also that they have included Indigenous peoples as allies to that movement of Black Lives Matter, that the recognition of the Indigenous struggle for recognition is a similar experience as expressed through Black Canadians and Black American people. So examples like that, I think there will see a huge demonstration of success around new initiatives that bring cultural groups together, such as the Black North Initiative. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And there's a question here for you, Caroline. But just before we go into that, I also wanted to share from my own perspective as a Black person, who of course is not in the US where a lot of this mushroomed, but having come here from the other parts of the world, from Nigeria specifically, where there is quite a bit of homogeneity and just some of the lack of understanding too around Indigenous struggles here. I have to say, in my own journey to finding, to learning and building knowledge around the experiences of Indigenous people, I haven't seen a more humbling and more remarkable, for lack of a better word, time than to see how these communities with varying challenges, but also in the same struggle, coming together to fight, to push against the same status quo, to fight for the same thing and working in solidarity. I think that a process such as that in itself is empowering for everyone involved. And Sam, wanted to also check with you for one who was on the ground. You spoke to your experiences being in Chicago and just being on the ground and seeing how even with the recent elections, the efforts and the strength of some of the Black communities that you've been around. How would you say that movement has resonated or has contributed to shifting the tide on within that political landscape or across social and economic fronts as well?
Thank you for the question. And I feel like it intersects with so many different pieces. And I did want to touch on something you mentioned earlier as well around how women were being impacted by the pandemic, specifically women of color, and how much it's prevented the efforts towards equality in terms of the gender wage gap, as well as women in the workforce. And so I see that playing out directly in the United States specifically. And in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and just in general, Black organizers on the ground in the United States, I mean, really are the backbone of so much of the work that's being done, specifically because those lived experiences are informing the efforts to connect authentically with other individuals from marginalized communities. And I really do think that that's been successful, as you've seen the coalitions that have been made. And I keep going back to the 2020 election, but maybe because I feel like I'm still in it, but it was definitely a great kind of thought ground to think about how certain states that were considered to be written off or different efforts that were considered to be ineffective were actually turning out young people and people of color in the largest margins that we've seen in a really long time. And just the voter turnout was so high. And I think that's because even in the pandemic, or maybe because of it, right, people saw how greatly intersecting the issues were in their daily lives with who's representing them in positions of leadership. And if they felt represented at all, I mean, we know that the majority of elected officials, especially in the United States, are white men and do not reflect the lived experiences of so many who live across the country. And I do think that representation matters. And for a while, you know, I always thought like the political sphere might not be the one where I would see myself, irony in that, or in which I would see organizing happening as being most effective. But I do think that having different leaders in those positions changes the conversation and reshapes the structures, because people from the outside have that perspective and aren't really inundated with all of the, you know, the weeds of what it is in the day-to-day position of leadership, and are really able to reimagine what elected office can look like and the relationship to your constituents.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. And on the fact that representation matters, Rochelle, are there things that you are seeing as well in terms of youth organizing and working together to, again, push for a shift, to push for change? And how would you say institutions are responding in this time?
For sure, being on the ground and helping with pushes on different resources that youth are asking for. I feel like there's a lot of youth out there in two separate categories. A category where they feel stuck, that they don't have the right resources to take action and to be on that movement. And then there's a youth that, yes, they don't have the resources, but they're making up their own and they're setting that example for them. In saying that, long story short, do you mind repeating the question one more time so I don't go on a tangent?
I'm asking if institutions are stifling the speed, the momentum that's building within particular communities, whether it's of youth, whether it's of people of color. How are people organizing to build momentum in this time?
For sure. I can see through where I am currently in British Columbia that youth are creating more online platforms and Q&A discussions like we're having, and they're opening up that dialogue with council, with members of parliament, and vice versa. I can see that our members of parliament are being more open front and opening up their hours to a lot of young people to discuss what's bothering them, how can we take action, and there's a lot of openness, but at the same time, there are institutions, which I'm definitely not going to name, that are in our community, that are advertised on a global scale, that think that one way is their way and that's the way to go. And I feel like that's something that needs to be talked about more. And it's environments, it's those toxic environments that need to have youth representation, especially during a pandemic. Once again, to sum everything up, youth representation, that's where it's at, and it needs to be supported. And our members of parliament and council, they're doing a great job, but by these larger institutions such as universities, health advocacies, and just larger organizations in general, they need to hop on board and get on this dialogue as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And just going back to the question, Carol Ann, so there's a question here for you around the critical steps to take in making changes within systems immediately and in the long run. And there's an example for economic inclusion of Indigenous communities. Do you think it is more effective to focus on specific issues within specific communities first, like in BC, and then scale up at national level for nationwide change? Or should that be a coordinated effort nationwide? Would you be able to respond to that kindly?
For sure, thank you. In my previous work on the Canadian Economic Growth Council, what was brought to my attention was the lack of Indigenous economic design. There was programs and services, but there was no actual structure that supported the design and evolution of Indigenous economic growth. Now, how I see that expressed right now, and what was important to me is that to shift that, instead of having Indigenous peoples reflected as a cost on the system, was to aspire to the potential of the Indigenous economy itself. So in doing that, in establishing a $100 billion national Indigenous economic target, what became important was that there was an aspiration and a theory of change that supported Indigenous economic empowerment. And there was also this organization of tangible Indigenous economic activity that was already happening within the 630 nations across this country. With that narrative shift was this new focus of we are economic powerhouses in this country, and how do you build that structure, systems, tools, and institutions to reflect Indigenous economic empowerment instead of on the gaps and falling behind. So what we see today in this response as well is that inclusion across a full spectrum also means inclusion in Indigenous health data, inclusion of economic impact regionally. In looking at this concept of the interrelationship between seeing Indigenous peoples as a problem, building a response from seeing Indigenous peoples as a problem, versus establishing a pathway of design, empowerment, and economic strength. That's really what we're seeing, as well as nations in this country are focusing on access to resources to protect the health of the populations, as well as protect the economies and the economic function and structures of responding in a COVID environment. So in terms of the issues versus the scaling, I think the diversity of being able to understand, even like what we're seeing in the Mi'kmaq region here in Canada, of a industry response steeped in racism that comes from the narrative of 153 years of the development of this country. So economic exclusion has become the normal. Now the process for scaling is now more focused on what is the structures, tools, institutions, and processes for Indigenous economic inclusion. That is really where Canada needs to go in education, in system design, and an economic response to now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do we have any other response to that question? Okay. Caroline, something you mentioned here, and which I am burning to get to, is the need for collecting data. Increasingly, Canada has been on that path clamoring for, we need to know who's not in the room. We need to get race-based data for us to know where the push points are. Are there thoughts and sentiments around this?
Absolutely. I like this concept of money, meaning, and metrics in emerging Indigenous economic strength. How we experience money, the inequality of the pathway of the meaning and experience of money is also directly connected to the data and the valuation of Indigenous lands, access to opportunities, and the actual systemic polarization of Indigenous economies and how that's expressed in the legal reality of today. I describe essentially that Canada is in a push-pull relationship with the Indigenous population, and every court case that goes and is won by Indigenous nation pushes Canada into a new reality. And there's new metrics and meaning that establish this formative narrative that we're economic powerhouses. We've done that in a legal design, but that's expressed in an economic space. And it's when we're able to establish and connect and align the experience of money, the experience of data and metrics, and the experience of that into Canada's reality today, that's when we're going to see responsive policy, responsive regulations, and systemic Indigenous economic design.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sam, do you have some thoughts on the need for data collection and how that could accelerate the speed for change?
Yeah, I think, Caroline really hit on so many of the points. And I know at least in the United States, the data collection is extremely important, especially given the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think a lot of times, and I remember advocating for it, people didn't understand why the need for demographic data was so important. And it was to really demonstrate the disproportionate impact it was having on communities of color and the need for more resources. And oftentimes, right, when you come with all of these great ideas in theory, people say, where's the data? And I think that that's very frustrating when people think that the only way that change is possible is if you have, concrete metrics to come from, but also those help advocate for, where resources should be distributed, where what populations are being impacted the most, and where does that fall in all of the demographic categories, especially, with age and race and gender. So I do think it's really important. I think it's often an overlooked element given the costs associated with collecting data. And also, even on the other hand, I think about people's willingness to give data and information. And I know in the United States, we recently did a census count that happens every 10 years. And when we did it recently, there was a lot of fear when people would, have a door knock asking for certain information that was supposed to be like, de-identified for their name and information, but would just have the categories necessary. But a lot of people were living in fear because of immigration status or other pieces. And so I think the transparency about how data will be used and making sure that those who are participating know the full extent to what that data will be used for and by who and for what purpose is extremely important.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And just recently, just yesterday, I was reading an article that came out around the UN and multilateral organizations and some of the terrible impact that the use of technology for data collection is having on particularly impacted groups or exposed groups, or better put, vulnerable populations, including refugees and immigrants across the world. And so there is no denying the impact, the negative impact that this data collection could potentially have if it infringes the rights of people. Rochelle, not sure if you have some thoughts around this as well.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Ruth. I enjoyed this question to an extent, and one of those reasons being I'm currently on a organization called Pivot Canada, and what they did was they took 1,200 youth from around Canada to collect data from different cities in our country. So I've been able to see 27 indicators on living costs, on entertainment, on things that matter to youth, on financial literacy, and seeing what the deficits are, what's missing, and all of that. So just to backtrack a little bit, I feel like data is a story. It's a story of who we used to be, who we are, and what we can be. And I feel like that's so important. But at the same time, people need to be careful. Organizations need to be careful when collecting data, especially when it comes to minority groups and such as groups like newcomers and racialized communities, only because all voices, yes, need to be included, but it's a matter of how are you going to do this while supporting those voices to make sure we don't minimize the data that we're collecting. In saying this, I think it's important to collect, yes, to keep youth involved, check mark, yes, but lastly, to make sure that the data people are collecting for the pandemic and for anything in general has a mission, vision, and purpose that includes minority groups, and that you're making sure that people of minority are on these groups collecting data, if that makes sense. Thanks, Ruth.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Fernanda, I just shared the link to the article that that I was referring to. I really, really appreciated how Carol Ann put it as well around money, meaning, and metrics in relation to Indigenous people. But behind numbers, we need to ensure that the power stays in the hands of the people that are directly impacted, or the people with the lived experiences themselves. And there's got to be that onus for them to tell their own stories. I see another question here to Carol Ann. What are the critical steps to take for making changes in the system immediately and in the long term? For example, oh, that's the same one from before. It's just shifted position. There's another comment here from Adrian around the Black Lives Matter movement and how it's sharpening awareness on prejudice. And I see the word tokenism. I have some thoughts on that, but just wondering too with the panel if we could dig into that a little bit, but more so harm and prejudice and how those can be hidden deeper, powered by governing laws and those who get impacted. Who are those stuck trying to break through and share? A glass ceiling stops us right here in BC. No one racial group injustices are increased by harmful laws preventing engagement. I feel like there still needs to be a bit of context around that. But Rochelle, want to bring this to you because, again, we're contextualizing and just talking about BC. You live and work in Surrey, where we have the largest racialized population within the province. Are there norms and trends? Are there prevalent happenings within that community or within that region that you say, based on your own forecast or your knowledge over time, might outlive some of these shifts and changes that we're seeing? Are there particular norms that you think might not exactly be advantageous that would outlive these strong systems and changes that we're seeing from the grassroots?
Right. Ruth, you might need to come back to me. I'll think hard about this question if you don't mind.
Absolutely. I just thought, given that we're here in BC and your own proximity with being in Surrey, does anybody else want to go for that one?
I had something to add back to the data question, if that's all right. I was thinking about, this comes to mind for me even as a city councilor. Oftentimes, we only talk about the data and we forget that those numbers often represent people and families and lived experiences. So even, thinking about the death toll or the cost of educating a student, right? All those numbers actually attribute to real people's lives. And that's something that I think oftentimes in people in positions of power, the more they move up, the less they realize the impact of the data on people individually. And I also, in my day job, I work at a nonprofit that works with researchers. And, oftentimes the discussion is around how are there going to be genuine and effective community practice partnerships. So scholars working with community members to get the data that they want. And so how important it is to report back that information, to the groups that ask for it. And so that was just something I was reflecting on as my co-panelists were also touching on the topic that I wanted to share.
Absolutely. Do we have some final thoughts on that as we start to get into the last phase of our conversation today?
Caroline here. Not living in Surrey, I live in Victoria, which actually is a very surprisingly and sometimes shockingly lack of diversity in the visual scape of the city itself. And oftentimes I'm walking along and there's lineups in different places or conferences, and just realizing the experience of exclusion and how much that uncomfortable space is being created now, where people's leadership in the experience of exclusion is being called into this space of today. It's really no longer okay to just stand behind the simplicity of I don't see race, because there's a privilege in that itself. We've moved as a country, as a neighboring country, we've moved past that because the people are the ones not being seen as racial under that construct of a sentence are now building a response to that itself. So this is really about personal leadership of where are you in building understanding of the experience of other, the worldview of other, and that even that simple requirement to respond beyond, I don't see color, I don't see race. I am a racialized person, and the concept of even saying I am Indigenous is a political statement. My identity is political. And with that realization, what we're hearing, and I essentially built this concept of indigenomics as a response to 500 plus years of colonization. What is that response? The inequality of pathways in finance, the inequalities within political system design. To build a response essentially means we are succeeding within places that were never meant for us as Indigenous peoples. And with that realization as an Indigenous person, all the policies that shaped the formation of this country were intended for my entire racial identity to be wiped out. So I think even there's there needs to be more understanding of racialized groups here in Canada, of even the definition of boundaries between Canada and the United States even. What actual role Indigenous peoples played in that, because those relationships still play out today. So being able to understand that, the economic function of that, all those conversations, I think, is about being a more responsible leader, feeling comfortable in these conversations, being able to ask the right questions and to participate in a meaningful way. I really like, there's an author, Sean, I'll put his name on the bottom list here, but he basically calls into the question of the structures of land ownership within this country, and calls on every one of us as citizens to realize the systemic design of those structures. And to, again, I think that has shaped where we're seeing Indigenous land and people recognition in a much more stronger and visible way today, that we live and benefit in specific ways, and how that has shifted even from 10, 15 years ago. So this is also an exercise of visibility and invisibility. So how are actions perpetuating invisibility? That's a point of self-reflection in our leadership. How are our actions inclusive of new perspectives? That's really what it means to me to identify our leadership in this discussion today, and not, I mean, I look to the chief of police of the RCMP, who is declining racism exists within the RCMP, when all the media stories are reflecting that there's a different experience for a young white boy versus a young Indigenous woman or a young Black woman. The experience of the relationship to the police and these as institutions. It's time to be able to, the simple truth, racism exists, and to not see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. There was way too many negatives in that sentence, but essentially what I'm saying is we have the ability to choose to see racism, and we also have the ability to choose it doesn't exist. And there's a lot of people that are existing on that side of the spectrum that says it doesn't exist. And I think that's what COVID has also brought in, if the inequalities of the system has established the perfect conditions for a greater experience of the COVID pandemic. And that's really the divide that we're referencing to, and even bringing this conversation together.
Absolutely, Caroline. And increasingly, there's that push for, I would say, understanding as more and more is becoming obvious within systems that exist. Without getting into the definitions of it, just how systems by nature can perpetuate certain cycles, and those cycles could be of inequalities, they could be racist cycles, or whatever it is. Do we want to touch a little bit on the nature of systemic racism and how we've seen them play out within systems and structures, whether it's in government, or it's in academia, or it's in leadership, corporate leadership? How do we see these systems perpetuating themselves? I know we've touched on some of those today, but more concretely, if we just wanted to name them and then go from there to how do we start to tackle and how do we start to move the needle around these issues? Sam, would you like to go with this?
Sure, and I'm going to go with a historical example because that's what came to mind when you shared, because it is playing out still today, but it was decisions that were made structurally that have perpetuated, right, codified racism. So after World War II in the United States, there was something called the GI Bill, which gave access to higher education through like college access, as well as access to really affordable ways to get home ownership very early on after service in the military. And that was disproportionately given to white veterans over Black veterans, specifically in the United States. And over time, right, if you had access to higher education, you could get a higher paying job. You had access to home ownership is considered, a form of wealth. And then over time, right, through generation and generation, that generational wealth passes on. So when you talk to people today who have a family home in a really wealthy suburb of Boston, they'll tell you, oh, it's not racism, or, it's not, I didn't personally do anything, right, that got me this house, but they're not understanding the connections between that historical legacy of that generational wealth. And there's a really bad stark statistic in Boston, which is the closest, huge city to where I live in the United States, where the net worth, I believe, of like a white family in Boston is like over $100,000, the average, and of a Black family is $8. Okay, and that stark reality is the impact of that generational wealth. So I think the decisions that local, state, and federal leaders make, right, creates these dynamics that further divide. And a lot of times people who think we live in a quote unquote post-racial society think that because they haven't experienced X, Y, or Z, that racism doesn't exist, and that they, operate in this colorblind mentality, which is so far from the reality that we're living in. And I think that, again, the 2020 election, speaks volumes about what that really means in real practice and time.
Thank you, Sam. Rochelle, do you have a reaction to that?
Yeah, for sure. Also, I just want to backtrack. Adriana, I responded to your question in the chat as well. Onto this one, I've seen systemic racism be prominent in organizational onboarding systems, especially with localized organizations here. For example, I think it's very overlooked when it comes to diversity inclusion and thinking about who to choose for your board, or even who to be a part of a team of an organization. And being in a predominantly South Asian community, sometimes it can be hard to outsource people to be a part of a diverse culture. But in saying that, it's not hard to find different perspectives and different cultures and different backgrounds to be a part of an organization that is taking action for the community that you live in. Long story short, systemic racism is definitely real, definitely seen within even local politics in a lot of communities in Canada, specifically in Surrey and Metro Vancouver, where you'll see different policies that are made for specific groupings, but it comes down to equality. Is that policy even, is it fair? Is it, I can get into so many different examples, but I'll leave it short and simple for that. And yeah.
Thank you, Rochelle. And picking up on something that Caroline and I were discussing earlier when we were trying to piece together what this session would look like, was on the idea of centering our leadership. And also creating room and space for emerging voices. And if we're not, I would encourage your questions to please keep them coming as we're trying to wrap up now. But while we wait for other questions to come in and we start to think about hanging the hat today, I want us to talk about how we can center our leadership, how we can engage more collaboratively, and how we can empower emerging voices on these issues that have lived beyond us all. Rochelle, do you want to pick up?
Yes, please. Yeah. All right. First of all, before we even try to consider how to empower emerging voices or centering leadership, we need to consider our why values first and frame that around our passions and make sure that we have that not necessarily set in stone, but we're honing in on those values. And secondly, recognize that providing an equal voice matters, and that young people, they also have opinions, and that the older generations, the wiser generations, as I like to call it, they also play a large role in helping make a platform for these voices to be heard. So how do we center our leadership? It's all about recognizing the values that we bring to the table and sourcing out different people that share those values and creating a platform for emerging voices.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rochelle. Caroline, do you want to share some thoughts?
What is important to me is responsibility of how I use my voice. There's a cultural teaching that we have of speak so that your words land. And what is important in that is you could be speaking, but your words are all over the place and they're lacking, like, where are they actually landing and having that impact? But in order to have that impact of your words landing, there's a personal care. There's a care for self, a care of your energy, care of your home. And that sense of self, I think Samantha referred to that in her experience of being a young leader in the US right now, of the expression of self, rights, and how we relate to others. And that's also very much up for question right now in this strange reality that we're living in. How do we relate to others? And in that, there's also that responsibility of how we relate to self. So that's really my response to this question, is that my hopes for this moment is that we increase our responsibility as leaders, because one, we care for self, and two, in the leadership of how we express ourselves, we build and create space, we listen, we collaborate, and the creative moment that we're in now is that time to really be ensuring that we acknowledge how system has not worked for us, impacted us negatively over time, or also that to take into account what our leadership requires us to do or say today. So making the uncomfortable space safe is something that's important to me. In my work in Indigenomics, in talking of Indigenous economic empowerment, in shaping a future of Canada that establishes a target of economic inclusion and an economic target of $100 billion Indigenous economy, that we can be uncomfortable, but we can also be safe in that uncomfortableness. And that's really what I'm seeing and is important in understanding system design, is that it starts from self, it starts from self-accountability, self-care, and a stronger sense of self that is in relationship to others. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Systems design starts with the self. Sam, do you have some thoughts as well?
Yes, well, I agree with everything that Rochelle and Carol Ann said, and definitely something I think about a lot. I think of even just centering leadership and relating to others is very different in this age of social media and the internet. I think that both the ways in which the digital divide exists and how, online communication brings us closer together, I do feel like people are not always saying the things that they would say to someone in person, right? We have kind of this misnomer of what online space could look like with, bullying and abuse. And when I think of centering leadership, and even as Rochelle said, like young people, emerging voices, I really just think about listening and making sure that we have an asset-based mindset and of appreciative inquiry, where we're really looking at all of the positive things that we have to bring together. And really build off of our own collective hope. When people organize, when they're voting, when they're engaging in the process, they believe in something better, and they want to participate in that. And I think that any type of energy should be welcomed, and that leadership should be shared. It should be horizontal. We're all, on the same page, working towards the same goals, and definitely, understanding how identity impacts, people's experiences are impacting how they see the world. And I do think that there is, as I mentioned, at the very beginning, kind of full circle, how there's just this individualistic approach to the world right now, that the more and more that we listen to one another, and just try to, to seek to listen, and not to speak. I think, what is it, or seek to understand. I know there's a saying where, people listen to other people just so that they can say their next statement rather than actually listening to what the person's saying. And I think that goes well with Carol Ann's quote that she shared. So I definitely think that there's a lot of work to be done, but I'm so eager to do it. And I think that if I've gained anything from this conversation today, it's really just that there are so many wonderful people who are, putting themselves out there to really change our systems and ensure that all voices are being heard. And the more and more that we listen to one another and have spaces like this for dialogue and discussion, we'll be able to get a lot closer to, our ideal reality.
Thanks, Sam. Rochelle, your thoughts on centering leadership?
For sure. I love always tossing in this quote, and it's age doesn't matter when it comes to making a difference. No matter if you're 110 or 5 years old, centering leadership and making a difference go hand in hand, and you're never too old for that as well. Also, those are my notes, and my final notes on everything that we've talked about today is to keep empowering each other through our work and research, whatever it may be. By supporting each other, we're creating a community of kindness, and that's exactly what Canada and even our world needs the most currently.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Rochelle. I would want to hang it up on that, but just wondering, do we have any final thoughts on building our inclusive future, or any final thoughts that you just want to add to the plethora of conversations today?
Carol Ann here. My perspective as well is that we get to be the ones that are alive during this time. It's difficult, we're struggling, but we're also, each one of us as panelists have been brought into this conversation because we've been shaped and informed through the shoulders of giants that we are able to see, we're able to speak to. And what is important in this is that we're able to open our eyes to truly see, that we're able to use our voice to truly speak, and that what we build is our response. And we are really the lucky ones who are able to experience this and address this right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol Ann. Sam, do you have some thoughts as we wrap up?
Yes, well, I feel like some of the things I'm thinking about the most are, those sayings of like decisions are made by those who show up. And I would add who continue to show up, who are relentless and consistent, and continue to agitate. I think regardless of the issue that you're most excited about tackling or the people you want to work with, continue to organize and to be in those spaces, because I think oftentimes there is an incentive not to be part of the political process, right? How hard is it to vote? How hard is it to get accurate information about what is happening and to have access to individuals in positions of leadership? And it's designed that way because it wasn't designed, for all people to participate. And so the more and more that we do participate and show ourselves in all of the places, that's when, our democracies will be more fruitful, it'll benefit from them, and they'll just be more of an accurate representation of what we as a society want from our communities and from our leaders.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sam. And just checking in with our participants today, if there is any pressing question as we wrap things up. I don't see any hands being raised. It's been both an honor and a great pleasure for me today to go on this journey, to be sharing this space and time with you. I have so much that I'm walking away from here with, that I'm leaving this space with. The fact that age really doesn't matter when it comes time to make a difference. Thank you very much, Rochelle, for that. Sam, leadership should be horizontal. It should be shared, and we all have a place in that. And hearing from you, Carol Ann, we need to increase our joint responsibilities and making the uncomfortable space safe for everyone. And that's how together we build an inclusive future. That's how together we ensure that we are building systems that work for us and generations to come. Thank you all so much for being part of this conversation today. I hope you have a really, really lovely day for the rest of today.